Good afternoon, all the nerds out there. I hope you all are doing fine. And as usual, you must be busy in your nerdy stuff, right? And guess what? Close everything and come and join me. Because today we are going to dive into the world of post structuralism. And as you can see in your screen, we have this Foucault, Kristeva, Todorov, all of them we are going to unveil. Right. And in our previous class, we have already discussed about structuralism and all the critics or theorists who belong in structuralism. We already covered it. And you know what? Whoever belong to structuralism, they have all the influence in post-structuralism as well. They also belong here. So like, for example, we have Roland Barthes, right? And that we have discussed in structuralism. He's also a major player in post-structuralism as well. So what I can say, you should go back and watch structuralism lecture. It's kind of a little bit longer, like 1 hour, but trust me, if you finish that, then your half of the literary criticism is done, right? So let's come back to post-structuralism. So we have introduction to post-structuralism. First of all, let's quickly look at what is structuralism. As I told you, we have already detailed discussion on structuralism. You can go back and watch. But by the way, the structuralism is actually rooted in linguistic, and post-structuralism is a kind of rebel. And post-structuralism challenges structuralism foundational ideas. So remember this. And as you know, both critique self-sufficiency and structuralism. Right? Post-structuralism questions on binary opposition, and again, it rejects interpreting within one pre-established structure. As everybody know that structuralism seeks linguistic structure in culture, and it has concrete reality meets abstract ideas. And as you know, post-structuralism introduces a third order. That means it focuses on constructing meaning, and as you can see, assumption of permanent sign definition. And structuralism, linguistic structure under scrutiny, and post-structuralism question linguistic sign and stability. And both addresses language's role in understanding. Post-structuralism disrupts established norm, and it is also a dynamic shift in literary theory. And as you know, we have here all the list. You can see Roland Barthes, that we have already discussed in structuralism. Jacques Derrida, that's we're gonna discuss in deconstruction. Michel Foucault, that will be a special focus in this particular session. We have Gilles Deleuze, Jean Baudelaire. We already discussed cultural studies, where we talked about that simulacra, simulation, and all these stuff. We talked about it. And Pierre Bourdieu we have already discussed in Marxism, and Lyotard also in Marxism. Julia Kristeva, that we are gonna talk about, and Helen Sixyours, that we have put it in gender studies, and soon the lecture will be in your app. Anyway, so this is all about post-structuralists that you can see over here. Now let's move quickly to Michel Foucault, and as I told you, here we're gonna give a special talk on Michel Foucault. As you know, Michel Foucault is a French philosopher, activist, and literary critic who left an enormous impact on the way we think about power, knowledge, and society. Foucault was all about dissecting how power and knowledge dance together in society. He wanted to know how those big institutions we have, like schools, government, and hospitals, they use these things to control us and shape our lives. Now, even though people often try to slap labels on him like a structuralist or post-structuralist, Foucault himself said that, now I'm not buying it. I'm neither a structuralist nor postmodernist. So he rejected those labels. His ideas have spread like wildfire, touching fields like communication studies, psychology, feminism, and a bunch of more. As we know, he was born in France, 1920s, And Foucault grew up in a well-off family. He hid up with the Lycée Henry IV and then went on to École Normale Supérieure. I don't know how French are pronounced, but anyway, where his brain got some heavy lifting from his tutors. And guess what? Who were these tutors? Jean Hippolyte and Louis Althusser. And he was all about philosophy, psychology, and earned his degree in those fields. But this dude wasn't just about the ivory tower. He was out there fighting against racism, human rights, abuses, and of course, pushing for changes in the way the penal system works. Sadly, Foucault's story had a tragic ending. He passed away in Paris due to complication from HIV/AIDS, becoming the first notable figure in France to get this disease. Now let's talk about some of his standout works. Right, and as you can see here, we have a list. Here, The History of Madness, 1961. And followed by The Birth of the Clinic in 1963. In the order of the thing, he shook up the way we categorize knowledge. Then came The Archeology of Knowledge in 1969, where he explored how we understand history. And again, one more, Discipline and Punish, dropped in 1975, taking a hard look at the prison system. And let's not forget The History of Sexuality in 1976, where he delved into the complex world of, well, you guessed it, sexuality. Right, and that was all about this. And now notable ideas that we're going to discuss one by one in where they belong, like in which particular work these terms belong, and that we'll discuss later, right? And again, we have biopower. So these notable ideas that you should know, because in exam you get at least one question from Foucault, or sometime 3 questions. In previous exam, I think they asked two times. So remember this, to know all these notable ideas are quite important for you. So first we have biopower, then disciplinary, discourse analysis, discursive formation, dispositive, episteme, archaeology, environmentality, heterotopia, gaze, limit, experience, power, knowledge, panopticism, and subjectivation, and there are a couple of more. So here you can see govern mentality, which is kind of the organized practices like mentalities, rationalities, and technique through which subjects are governed. Right, and panopticism, on the other hand, is a kind of formula for disciplinary power, can be seen in philosopher Jeremy Bentham's plan for the optimal prison. And again, the panopticon, such a person, it is a kind of prison, consists of circle formed building where only one prisoner inhabits every cell. Right, so that is all about Foucault's notable idea. Now we'll move quickly to our first work, The History of Madness, 1961. So there is this book, The History of Madness, as you can see over your screen, and it is also known as Madness and Civilization. What it does is actually dig into how people's ideas about madness changed in Europe from way back in the Middle Ages until the late 18th century. But it's not just about crazy folks. It's also a big critique of how we think about history and how we study it. Foucault's brain journeyed from phenomenology, it's a kind of fancy word for studying consciousness, and towards something kind of like structuralism, right? Which is all about the structures in society and language. He breaks down this whole evolution of madness in 3 chunks, as you can see: the Renaissance, the Classical Age, and the modern era. So it's like a deep dive into how society viewed and dealt with madness over the centuries. Now we have here the birth of the clinic and the medical gaze. So this gaze term is actually coined by Foucault in The Birth of the Clinic. It's very important because this theory you can apply in all kinds of research that you are doing, right? So it's a kind of perspective term like gaze. So here we'll discuss anyway. So the birth of the clinic is a book that looks at how hospitals, especially teaching ones, they became important places for medicine. It talks about something called the medical case. This is basically how doctors look at a patient's body objectively, focusing on the body itself rather than the person as a whole, right? The book dives into how medicine worked back in the late 17th hundred, particularly how doctors gathered knowledge. So this term, medical case, they still use today, especially in medical and social work field. It's all about how doctors see the body as a thing to be examined, separate from the person identity. So think about when you go again to any clinic or visit your doctor, they look at you as a whole body like it's a machine and it is not working. So they don't look at you like you are a person. For them, you're just a body. So that's what medical gaze is, right? Next is The Order of the Things. The Order of Things, 1966. So this book came around 1966 and it's all about this fancy idea called structuralism, and which he was pretty into back then and but later kind of stepped away from. In this book, he says that every historical period has its own set of ideas and ways of thinking. So these ideas and ways of thinking are like the rulers of the kingdom. They, decide what's true and what's cool to talk about. Foucault goes deep talking about how these ideas shaped fields like biology, economics, and linguistics. He's basically digging into the origin of these subjects and how they evolved over time. Now let's quickly move to the heterotopia, which is a very important term and it was actually found in this particular the order of the things. So let's chat about heterotopia. Foucault throws this term around to describe places that are, well, kind of weird. They're like alternate realities within our society. They can be unsettling, incompatible, or totally different from what's outside. Think about it like this. If you have your normal world, but then there are these places like ships, cemeteries, or even brothels that are sort of like mirror images but also totally disrupt the norm. Foucault brings up these ideas in different time periods like classical antiquity and modernity. He talks about how language, living things, and money were all understood differently in those periods. So he even dives into three epistemes, which is kind of big fancy word. Basically, it means different ways of knowing stuff. There was one in the Renaissance where things were all about looking alike. Then we have in classical era where it was all about categorizing and organizing. And again, we have the modern one here, which is a big part of this book, where everything got all subjective and complex. Next, we have the Archeology of Knowledge. And as you know, it was written in 1969. It's basically a book about how we study and understand different systems of thought and knowledge. These systems, called epistemes, follow certain rules that often operates without us even realizing. The book dives deep into how these systems shape the way we use language and think in specific times and areas. It's like a set of rules that determine what's okay to talk about and think about it given a place and time. But again, here's the twist. Sometimes these ideas we take for granted don't hold up when you really examine them closely. Discourses which are basically big conversation about certain topics, and they can change and shift in strange ways. So in a nutshell, The Archeology of Knowledge is all about how we think and talk about this stuff, and how those thoughts and conversation can change in surprising ways. Now we have Discipline and Punish. So, Discipline and Punish is a book that came out in 1975. And as you can see, its full title is Discipline and Punish, the Birth of the Prison. In this book, the author looks at how the way we punish people has changed in the Western world, especially during modern times. The author argues that prisons didn't become the go-to way of punishing folks just because some reform-minded folk felt bad for the wrongdoers. No, it's more complicated than that. The book dives into how our ideas about power and the human body have shifted over time, leading to prisons being the big deal that they are today. And again, Foucault also points out that the whole idea of discipline and controlling people's behavior isn't limited to prison. Now, it's used in all sort of places like schools, hospital, and even military camp. Imagine you're going into school when you were a child. How many rules were there? What kind of discipline was there? I mean, you just name it. Everywhere these discipline, not even in school, but in hospitals, military camps, and nowadays the flat you're living, that also a kind of, it has become a prison. You have set of rules to follow, and if you don't follow, everybody will be, you know, pointing fingers at you. So these Discipline and Punish, if you read it, it's really gonna change the way you think about society, right? So again, one more thing that I wanna put it here. So the book is divided into four main parts. First, there is a look at a torture, then punishment, followed by discipline, and finally we get into the nitty-gritty of what prison is all about, right? And so it's like a deep dive into the history of ideas and those ideas behind how we deal with wrongdoings in society. The last one we have is the history of sexuality, and of course we're gonna move to biopower also. So the history of sexuality, as you can see, it was published back in 1976. And this work is a bit of game changer in the world of philosophy and social theory. So you must be wondering what it's all about. Well, Foucault takes us on a journey through the development of the concept sexuality in Western society. He argues that the idea that every prison has their own distinct sexuality is actually a pretty recent thing. Now, Foucault is known for his fancy sounding methods like archaeology and genealogy, right? But here's the case. He's all about examining how power plays out in society. In the first volume, he goes after this idea called the repressive hypothesis. Note down this important term, which is quite important. This is the notion that capitalism and bourgeoisie society held back sexuality from the 17th century to the mid 20th century. And Foucault says, no, not really. He points out that during this time there was actually more talk about sex. Experts started to study it scientifically, and they encouraged people to spill the beans about their sexuality, their sexual thoughts and actions. Then in the second and third volume, Foucault takes us way back to ancient Greece and Rome. He explores the role of sex in those societies, and it's not what you might expect. Now we'll just see what is biopower, and in previous exam this term came. So the school term Foucault throws at us biopower, and this is all about how modern nation states like control their citizens. It involves tons of techniques to control our bodies and regulate population. Foucault started using this term in his lecture at the Collège de France, and it's all about the way power works in our society. So in a nutshell, the history of sexuality is Foucault's way of shaking up how we think about sex, power and society. It's like a philosophical roller coaster that challenges a lot of what we thought we knew. So guys, this is all about Foucault. Let me brief it one more time. So first up, we have got this panopticism, which Foucault explored in his work of History of Madness, right? So that's what I'm trying to mention, all the term where it was mentioned one more time so you can just remember. So imagine a prison where the inmates can't see the guards, but the guards can see them all the time. That's the essence of panopticism, right? Where constant surveillance keeps people in check. Next, we have got the birth of the clinic and the concept of the medical case. This is all about how doctors look at patients, diagnose them, and how this whole process has evolved over time. It's like a peek into the doctor's perspective. Moving on the order of the things, Foucault here talks about heterotopia. So remember, this term was coined in the order of the things. So it's a bit of mind bender. Think of it as a space that have multiple layers of meaning or contradictory function. It's like when a museum is also a library of a garden with a hidden maze. Now the archaeology of power, here we talked about discursive formation. Basically, it's how language and knowledge shape our understanding of things. Think of it as a building blocks of knowledge. And then we have discipline and punish, where Foucault takes us on a journey through the history of punishment and how society disciplines individuals. It's like a trip through the evolution of justice systems. Lastly, the history of sexuality brings us the concept of biopower. So this is all about how power exercised over an entire population, especially in terms of sexuality and reproduction. It's a deep dive into how society controls these aspects of our lives. Now we'll talk about Julia Kristeva, another important post-structuralist who was born in Bulgaria but living in France. And she wears many hats, guys. She's not just a writer, she's a psychoanalyst. Remember, that's someone who looks at how our minds work. She was also a critic, someone who gives opinions about things. A novelist, she writes a story as well, and she was also a teacher. In her writings, she's famous for talking about a bunch of things like how language works, why people do what they do, and why women's rights are important. In Paris, she hung out with some really smart people like Roland Barthes, Claude Lévi-Strauss. They were into fancy stuff like structuralism that we have already discussed in previous class. And of course, structuralism is something like looking at how things are put together. She was also active in Marxism. Marxism is a way of thinking about society. What's cool about Kristeva is that she mixed ideas from different smart folks like Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, and Mikhail Bakhtin. Her writings have two main parts. First, she talked a lot about how language works and how science and symbols come together to make meaning. Then she got really into psychology and feminism, especially looking at how women fit into all of this. One big thing she tried to do was to remind people that our bodies are important when we talk and think. It's not just about words on paper, it's also about how our bodies feel and move when we talk. So, Julia Kristeva is like this thinker who's all about exploring language, minds, and the rights of women, and she brings a unique perspective that includes both brains and bodies. Now we'll see one of the important work is Semiotic, which was published in 1969. And she has written books and essays that dive deep into things like intertextuality, which is basically how texts connect and talk to each other. She's also looked into some heavy topics like semiotic and objection in linguistics. Don't worry, if those words sound like jargon, we'll break them down. Kristeva isn't just about linguistics. She's into literary theory and criticism, psychoanalysis, diving into the human mind, and even biography and autobiography. She doesn't stop there. She gets into politics and culture, and she's got her fingers in the world of art and art history as well. Now let's talk about semiotic and symbolic. These are two big ideas she's known for. The semiotic is all about our basic instinctual side, like what a baby feels before it even knows words. The symbolic is more structured, rule following side that comes with language and culture. And I don't mix up with Kristeva's semiotic with the normal semiotics from Ferdinand de Saussure. They are similar but not quite the same. She also brings up this concept called Quora. Think of it as this wild, unstructured space in our mind where all our drives and emotions are swirling around. It's a bit like constant whirlwind that can't be neatly explained. Now we'll talk about one of the important terms that Kristeva coined, which is intertextuality. Intertextuality is like a cool idea that Julia Kristeva made famous while looking at Bakhtin stuff about dialogism and carnival. Right? These two terms we already talked in our structuralism. If you haven't watched it, then you should go and at least have a quick look at it, or at least you can have a look on PPTs that I have shared in your app. It's about how texts are buddies with each other and they are all mixed up with a bunch of meanings that can't be simplified. So imagine one text giving high fives to other text, and when a text mentions or copies stuff from other texts, that's intertextuality. Like Kristeva says that any text is like a busy intersection where tons of text meet up and have a party. It only exists because it knows other text and hangs out with them. But another smart critic thought of text as a quilt of quotes, a bit like a smoothie with many flavors. It can mean different things to different people, and it's all about fluid and flexible. We already talked about baths in our previous class on structuralism that you can go and watch. We have all talked about how is structuralism works and every single thing about structuralism. So intertextuality here supports this wild idea by Derrida that everything we understand is inside the text. Now shortly I'll give you example and you'll understand. So it's like a secret code that texts share and we are the ones trying to crack it. So for example, when we read something like Ulysses by James Joyce, right, we might see it as a modern experiment, a response to old epic story, or a part of some big conversation. This shows that a text's meaning isn't just in the words on the page, it's what we create in our heads while connecting all the text together. Now another important term is Quora here. So back in ancient Greece, they had this thing called Quora, which was like the area around the city, but not quite part of it. Plato, the famous philosopher, used the word to talk about a space or a kind of container where stuff happens. It's like the backstage area of reality. Some modern folks got in this Quora idea too, like Martin Heidegger, who said it's like a special open space where existence comes alive. Then there's our Julia Kristeva. She talks about Quora when she's comparing two fancy words, semiotic and symbolic. For her, Quora is like the state before things even get signs or symbols. It's like the blank canvas where meaning might have happened. But here's the catch. This Quora thing is slippery. You can sort of point to it, try to describe it, maybe even draw a map of it, but you can never really pin it down. It's like trying to grab a cloud. You can give it a shape, but it keeps changing. So in a nutshell, Quora is this cool concept that ancient and modern thinkers have played around with, trying to figure out how things exist and mean something. This is our last slide and it is about Todorov, who is a Bulgarian French smart critic, did a bunch of cool stuff in his life. He wrote a whopping 39 books, guys, which is seriously impressive, right? Some of his hits include The Poetics of Prose, Introduction to Poetics, The Conquest of America, The Question of the Other Thing, and Mikhail Bakhtin, The Dialogic Principle. So in this case, our Todorov becomes important in post-structuralism. One of his interesting topic was the fantastic, as you can see here. In his book, Introduction à la littérature fantastique, well, all about French guys, you can nail it by the way. He dived into the world of the spooky and mysterious. And Todorov talked about three kinds of fantastic stuff: the fantastic uncanny, the fantastic marvelous, and just plain old fantastic. Now, what's fantastic, you ask? Well, it's when something super weird happen in our everyday world. And it's so bizarre that we are not sure if it's real or just our imagination playing tricks on us. He gave an example from Jacques Cajote book La Diable Amorax. There's this dude named Alvaro, and he's head over heels for this lady. But here's the catch. He's not sure if she's a regular human or, wait for it, the devil in disguise. So he's got to figure out if he's in a supernatural romance or just caught up in a crazy illusion. So guys, this is all about post-structuralism. We have completed our session and I hope it will help you. Well, this session was really fruitful, and again tomorrow we're going to talk about deconstruction. Everybody was asking about it. Anyway, that's all guys, and thank you so much, and I'll see you tomorrow for deconstruction, right? So have a good day. Bye bye.